There is an exhausting way to live, and most of us have tried it at some point. Some of us are still in it right now. It is the constant monitoring of what other people think, adjusting what you say based on who is in the room, softening your convictions so nobody gets uncomfortable, saying yes when you mean no because disappointing someone feels unbearable, shaping your life around the approval of people who will never fully give it, and chasing it anyway. It is exhausting because it never ends. There is always another person to please, always another standard to meet, always another version of yourself to perform. Paul knew that trap. He had lived inside it. And in one sentence, he walked out of it permanently. Galatians 1:10. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. One question, sharp as a blade, and it cuts right through the noise of every voice competing for your approval today. Whose approval are you actually living for? To feel the full weight of this verse, you have to understand who Paul was before he wrote it. He was not someone who had always been indifferent to human opinion. Before his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul was Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee of Pharisees, a man whose entire identity was built on religious performance and the approval of the most respected people in his world. He had worked for it his whole life, studied under the best teachers, climbed the religious ladder with precision. By every measure his peers used to evaluate worth and standing, Saul was at the top, and he had the approval to prove it. Then Jesus showed up, and everything Saul had built his identity on, every source of approval, every carefully maintained reputation, became what Paul later called in Philippians 3, rubbish compared to knowing Jesus. That is not a small shift. That is a complete reorientation of identity. From a man who lived for the validation of the most powerful religious figures in Jerusalem, to a man sitting in prison writing letters about the freedom of living for our Father alone. The context of Galatians 1:10 matters enormously. Paul is writing to a church that is being pressured. False teachers have come in after Paul left and started telling the Galatian believers that faith in Jesus is not enough, that they also need to follow certain Jewish laws and customs to be fully acceptable to our Father. And some of the believers are bending, going along with it, because saying no to the teachers in the room was uncomfortable. Paul has zero patience for it. The opening of Galatians is the most direct, unfiltered version of Paul in the entire New Testament. He does not start with thanksgiving. He goes straight to the problem. And then he asks the question that exposes the root of the whole thing. Am I seeking the approval of man or of God? Because a person who is living for human approval will always bend when the pressure is strong enough. They will soften the truth when it costs them something. They will add to the gospel, subtract from it, reshape it. Whatever keeps the people in the room comfortable and the applause coming. But a servant of Jesus cannot operate that way. Not because the rules say so, because the moment you start editing the truth to manage people's reactions, you have already switched masters. You are no longer serving our Father. You are serving the room. Think about the moments in your own life where that pressure shows up. It is rarely dramatic. It usually looks small. The conversation where you stay quiet about your faith because you do not want to seem strange. The decision you made based on what people would think, rather than what our Father was clearly directing. The version of yourself you perform at work versus who you are at home versus who you are when you are alone with our Father. Paul is not asking you to be harsh or confrontational. He is asking you to be free. Free from the exhausting, impossible, never-ending project of managing what everyone thinks of you. Free to be exactly who our Father made you to be. Without editing, without performance, without shrinking to fit someone else's comfort level. That freedom is only available in one place. in the settled knowledge that you already have the only approval that lasts. Our Father's approval of you is not based on your performance. It never was. It was settled at the cross. When Jesus stood before Pilate, when the crowds who had shouted his name days earlier were now shouting, "Crucify him," he did not adjust his mission based on the room. He did not soften what he came to do because the approval had disappeared. He went to the cross for the joy set before him, Hebrews 12:2, not for the applause of the crowd, because his eyes were on our Father. And our Father's verdict on his life was not determined by what the crowd was shouting that Friday morning. The same Father who said of Jesus at his baptism, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." That same Father looks at you, covered by the work of Jesus, and says the same thing. "Beloved, pleasing, mine." That is your approval, complete, unchanging, not earned by performance, not revoked by failure, already yours. And once that lands, really lands, the approval of people starts to lose its grip, not because people stop mattering, but because their verdict on your life no longer has the final word. Here is what living for our Father's approval looks like practically. Because this is not just a theological concept, it is a daily decision that shows up in very specific moments. It looks like saying what is true even when the room wants something softer. Paul did not water down the gospel to keep the Galatians comfortable. He told them the hard thing because love tells the truth. A person living for human approval gives people what they want to hear. A person living for our Father's approval gives people what they need to hear, with grace, but without compromise. It looks like making decisions based on conviction rather than reputation. The next time you are facing a choice and the loudest factor in your thinking is what people will think, stop. Ask the Galatians 1:10 question, "Am I seeking the approval of man or of God?" Let the answer reorient the decision. And it looks like releasing the outcomes you cannot control. You cannot manage what people think of you. You never could. Some people will misunderstand you, some will criticize you, some will walk away. Paul was shipwrecked, beaten, imprisoned, and abandoned by people he loved. And he wrote some of the most joyful letters in human history from inside those circumstances, because his joy was not sourced in how people were treating him. His source was our Father. And our Father's opinion of Paul did not change based on who was currently persecuting him. There is a lightness that comes from living this way. Not arrogance, not a dismissiveness toward the people around you, but a genuine settled freedom that stops monitoring the room every few minutes to check if you are still approved of. The Galatian believers were bending under pressure because they had not yet fully received the freedom Paul was describing. They were still 1 foot in the gospel and 1 foot in the performance. And Paul was writing to pull them all the way into the freedom that Jesus had already purchased for them. He is writing the same thing to you today. You do not have to perform anymore. You do not have to edit yourself to manage the room. You do not have to chase an approval that people can give and take back on a whim. You already have the approval that lasts. From the one whose opinion of you never changes. From the Father who knew you before you were born and has not changed his mind since. Live from that. Make your decisions from that. Let that be the voice that is loudest in the room, even when every other voice is saying something different. Am I seeking the approval of man or of God? Answer that question every morning and watch what it does to the rest of your day.